Settle in and let your breathing slow, like a lamp dimming one small click at a time. Tonight, you are walking down into a mine where the air feels cool, close, and patiently dusty. You think uranium is going to look like glowing trouble, bright and obvious in the dark? It does not. It looks like ordinary rock, quietly waiting to be important to the Cold War and inconvenient to your lungs. In this little bedtime field trip with the Sleepless Scientist, you will drift through the routine of drilling and hauling, the soft math of risk that adds up over years, and the strange journey from ore to Yellowcake to paperwork to history. Nothing here needs to be loud to matter. Down underground, the danger is rarely dramatic. It is mostly boring, and that is the point. The first thing you learn is that the mine is not a single big cave. It is a long argument between humans and rock, made one small bite at a time. You walk under timber and steel, past damp stains that look like old weather. The ceiling presses close enough to feel personal. Your lamp throws a weak circle, and everything beyond it waits politely. The ground is uneven, scuffed by boots and cartwheels, and the slow dragging of hoses. You can smell oil, wet stone, and the faint metallic tang of machines working too hard. If you listen closely, you realize the mine is never quiet. It just uses small sounds. A fan rattles somewhere deeper in, pushing air that tastes like yesterday. Water drips with the steady patience of a clock that does not care about your shift. A distant drill chatters, then stops, then starts again, like someone knocking on a door that never opens. You might imagine mining as hero work, full of dramatic swings and sudden danger, but most of it is routine, and routine is what makes it effective. You go where you are told, you drill where the marks are painted, you load what breaks free. Then you do it again and again. In the Cold War, that repetition had a special flavor. Not romance, not glory. Urgency in a file folder. Somewhere above ground, someone with clean hands wanted uranium. They wanted it for reactors, for weapons, for stockpiles, for deterrence, for the kind of peace that keeps its finger on a trigger. Down here, all of that becomes simpler. It becomes a quota and a timetable and a supervisor who wants the cart filled. You are not holding history in your hands. You are holding a drill steel that vibrates your bones until they feel slightly borrowed. The rock in front of you does not look special. It looks like rock because it is rock. Sometimes the ore is in sandstone, pale and layered, like a dried river turned into a wall. Sometimes it is darker, heavier, with streaks that catch the light and refuse to explain themselves. If you see something greenish or yellowish, you might think, ah, there it is, the trouble. But most of the time, the trouble is subtle. The trouble is spread thin, like bad news whispered into a crowd. That is part of what made uranium mining so dull and so dangerous. The danger is not a glowing puddle you can step around. It is a background. It is the air you share with the stone. You reach the working face, where the tunnel ends for now. The air feels cooler here, and also older. Fresh air has a bright, sharp edge to it. Mine air is rounded off, used, handled too many times. A miner beside you checks the drill. The machine is not elegant. It is a loud, stubborn tool that turns electricity or compressed air into a spinning bite. When it starts, it fills the tunnel with a harsh rattle and a vibration you feel in your teeth. Dust jumps off the wall in a pale cloud, like flour shaken from a bag. You want to believe that dust is just dirt, but underground, dust is never just dirt. It is rock turned into tiny blades. It is minerals ground into powder fine enough to hide in the folds of your lungs. It is the most ordinary enemy in this place. They drill a pattern of holes, measured and practiced. The holes are the punctuation marks in the rock sentence. Later, someone will pack them with explosives. The explosion will be short, blunt, and not very cinematic. Just a sharp bang, a thud in your chest, and then the echo sliding away. After that comes the real work: shoveling, loading, hauling. The blast does not create treasure. It creates rubble, and the rubble must be moved. You lean into the labor, not because it feels noble, but because it is your job. Your gloves pick up grit. Your sleeves pick up dust. Your mouth picks up that faint taste that makes you want water even if the water is warm and stale. The ore is mixed in with waste rock, and you do not get to keep the difference. Someone else will measure it later. Someone else will decide what is worth processing. Here, underground, you are mostly moving weight from one place to another. Sometimes you use a mucking machine, a mechanical scoop that scrapes and clanks. Sometimes it is wheelbarrows, carts, and the patient suffering of backs and knees. The mine teaches us slow, physical truth. Rock is heavy, and humans are soft. You might also think the main threat is the radiation itself, the invisible rays that everyone fears. But in many uranium mines, the first killer was not the dramatic kind. It was the dusty kind, the slow kind, the kind that does not make a sound when it arrives. The work continues, and boredom does half of it. Boredom makes you take shortcuts because your mind wants the day to end. Boredom makes you stop noticing smells. Boredom makes you forget that air is a substance, not an empty space. And the mind loves that. The mind loves when you treat it like a hallway instead of a machine. Because the mind is a machine. It takes in people and metal and time. It produces ore and dust and wear. It produces paychecks and it produces consequences. On a schedule too slow to feel like cause and effect, you step aside while the ventilation hose is dragged forward. It looks unimpressive, like a big fabric tube someone forgot at a construction site. But it matters more than your muscles. Ventilation is the mind's real life support. Without it, you are not a worker. You are a short experiment. Air down here has to be forced to behave. Fresh air needs to be pushed in, and used air needs to be pulled out. If the air stalls, everything else gets worse. Heat gathers in pockets, even in a cold mine. Diesel fumes and oil mist hang in place. Dust takes longer to settle, and gases you cannot smell begin to collect, like quiet tenants moving into an empty apartment. One of those tenants is radon. Radon is a noble gas, which is a fancy way of saying it does not like making friends. It does not react much. It does not announce itself with a smell. It does not sting your eyes like chlorine. It just exists, slipping out of uranium-bearing rock as uranium slowly decays. And because radon is a gas, It drifts into the air spaces of the mine. If the ventilation is poor, it can pool in low areas and sit there patiently. Radon itself is not the only problem. The problem is what radon turns into. Radon decays into a chain of solid particles, sometimes called radon daughters, which sounds almost sweet. It is not sweet. These decay products can stick to dust. You breathe them in, and they stick inside you. Now the radiation source is not out in the rock. It is in your lungs, tucked into moist tissue that was designed for oxygen, not for radioactive hitchhikers. But you do not feel that in the moment. You feel the drill vibration. You feel the sweat cooling on your back. You feel the ache in your hands. The mine's worst math is done in the background. Dose is not a lightning strike. Dose is a slow accumulation, like coins dropped into a jar, one at a time, until the weight is undeniable. And in the early years of the uranium rush, many miners did not have the jar explained to them, or they had it explained in a way that felt far away, or they were told, gently, that everything was fine, which is a convenient phrase, because fine can mean many things. Fine can mean you will not drop dead today. Fine can mean the company will not pay for better fans. Fine can mean someone else will deal with the consequences later. You load ore onto a cart, and the cart squeals as it moves. The sound is thin and miserable, like metal complaining about its life choices. It rolls down the tunnel toward daylight or toward a shaft lift, depending on the mine. As it goes, it leaves a faint wake of dust stirred up by wheels. You can wipe your face and feel grit on your skin. You can blink and feel your eyelashes stick slightly, as if they have been varnished. A mask might help if you wear it. Some masks, back then, were little more than cloth, a polite suggestion. Some were better if they fit, if the filters were fresh, if you kept them on. But comfort is a powerful negotiator. A mask gets hot. A mask feels damp with your breath. A mask makes it harder to talk, and miners talk to stay human. So, the mask comes off sometimes, just for a minute, just for a breath that feels easier. Congratulations, you have met the oldest safety problem on Earth. The human body wants comfort now, and it is willing to bargain with later. The shift rolls forward in small tasks. You check supports. You listen for changes in the rock, small cracks that mean stress is rearranging itself. A mine can collapse quickly, but it usually whispers first. It creaks, it pops, it drops little grains of dust from the roof, like dandruff. You learn to notice these things because they are immediate. A rockfall is dramatic. It is loud and sudden and physical. It leaves a sharp memory. But the other dangers do not. They leave paperwork. Years later, they leave a cough that does not quite go away. They leave a scan with a shape that makes a doctor go quiet for a moment. And that time delay is what makes the mind feel deceptively safe. The mind likes enemies it can see. The mind offers you enemies that act like fog. As you work, you begin to notice the dust more than the rock. Dust coats the hoses. Dust coats the beams. Dust sits on every flat surface because gravity is reliable even underground. When your boot steps down, it leaves a print, like a fossil of the moment. When the drill starts again, the dust rises in slow swirls, catching your lamp beam and looking almost gentle. It would be beautiful if it were not what it is. Rock dust is not one thing. Some of it is silica, tiny crystals that can scar lungs over time. Some of it is mixed minerals, ground down into particles small enough to travel deep. Some of it carries the radon decay products we mentioned, like invisible burrs stuck to lint. Your lungs are not simple bags. They are branching trees, turned upside down, ending in millions of little air sacs. Those sacs are thin on purpose because oxygen has to cross into blood. Thin is efficient. Thin is also fragile. When you breathe dusty air, the biggest particles get caught earlier in your nose and throat. They irritate, they make you cough, they make you spit. But the smallest particles can slip deeper, all the way down to the quiet ends. Your body has defenses. It has mucus, sticky like a trap. It has cilia, tiny hairs that move in waves trying to carry debris upward. It has immune cells that roam like tired janitors, swallowing what they can. But those systems are meant for occasional intruders, not for a daily shift, not for years. When the exposure keeps happening, your defenses do what all overworked systems do. They fall behind. Scar tissue forms, thickening the delicate walls. Breathing becomes less efficient. A cough becomes a companion. And then there is the radon story, still unfolding invisibly. Radon gas seeps out of uranium-rich rock because uranium is not stable forever. It is like a long, slow crumbling at the atomic level. When radon is inhaled, you exhale much of it again. But the decay products, those solid bits, can lodge in your lungs. They emit alpha particles, which are heavy and blunt, like tiny cannonballs. Alpha radiation cannot travel far in air. A sheet of paper can stop it, so it sounds harmless at first. But inside lung tissue, where the source is right against cells, alpha particles can do serious damage. They strike DNA and cause breaks. Most of the time, the cell repairs it. Sometimes the cell dies, which is its own kind of safety feature. And sometimes the repair is wrong in a way that does not matter until much later. This is the slow math of risk. It is not fate exactly. It is probability repeated. A small chance multiplied by many breaths over many days. The mine does not have to be dramatic to be effective. It only has to be consistent. In the Cold War years, that consistency met a kind of industrial hunger. Governments wanted uranium fast, companies wanted contracts, towns wanted jobs, and miners wanted a steady wage in places where steady wages were rare. So the work continued, even when ventilation was poor, even when dust control was minimal, even when measurements were not taken or were taken quietly. A good fan down here is more heroic than courage. Courage does not move air. Courage does not dilute radon. Courage does not catch dust before it reaches your bronchi. A fan does. A fan is boring, which is exactly why it matters. You watch the airflow tug at loose threads on the ventilation tube. You feel the faint breeze on your cheeks. It is not much, but it is something. And you begin to realize that the mine is a battle between small forces. Airflow against gas, water spray against dust, time against lungs, regulations against budgets. The most unsettling part is how normal it feels. You can get used to almost anything, including conditions that slowly harm you. You can laugh underground. You can tell stories. You can eat your lunch with dusty hands, because everyone does. Normal is not the same as safe. Normal is just what happens when the unusual repeats long enough. Somewhere on the surface, someone might imagine uranium miners as glowing skeletons doomed instantly by radiation. That is not how it usually worked. It worked the way paperwork works. It worked the way rust works. It worked the way a small leak works when no one wants to shut the system down. And when safety rules finally arrived in many places, they often arrived late. They arrived after patterns showed up in health records, after miners got sick, after people asked questions that were hard to ignore, after the boring math became visible. You pause while the crew checks the area again. There is talk of airflow. There is talk of dust. Someone mentions a water spray line because water is the only polite way to ask dust to sit down. Someone else mentions the fan because air is the only thing between you and statistics. And you stand there, lamp humming, realizing the mine is run on arguments between invisible things. Dust wants to float. Radon wants to linger. Your lungs want clean air, and they are not getting a vote. So the crew does what crews always do. They negotiate with reality using whatever equipment the budget allows. A hose gets dragged forward, its fabric skin scuffed and gritty. A valve gets turned, and a thin mist starts hissing into the tunnel. It is not dramatic. It is just water atomized into a fog that makes the lamp beam look thicker. And it works. A little. Dust particles collide with droplets, gain weight, and fall like tired snow. You watch it happen in slow motion. Because underground, even physics looks sleepy. But the mist also makes everything damp. Your gloves get clammy. The rock face darkens. The floor turns slick in places. And now falling is a new hobby the mine offers you. This is the pattern with safety. Every fix creates a new inconvenience, and inconvenience is where humans start bargaining again. Ventilation is talked about the same way people talk about weather. You want good airflow, but you do not control it. The fan might be undersized. The ducting might leak. A door might be propped open the wrong way, letting air short-circuit and skip the dead end where you are working. The mine is full of little air politics. Air takes the easiest path, like gossip. If there is a wide tunnel back to the shaft, air goes there. If there is a tight heading where you are drilling, air might not bother. So humans build stoppings and curtains and brattices, temporary walls meant to force air into places it would rather ignore. It is carpentry, not heroism. It is also life support. Radon is patient about all of this. It does not rush. It seeps out of rock grains, the way a smell seeps out of an old jacket. And if the air change rate is low, radon concentration can rise without anyone noticing. You cannot smell it. You cannot taste it. Your eyes do not water. You just keep inhaling because breathing is a habit you are emotionally attached to. The measurements, when they exist, come from small machines and careful sampling. An air pump draws mine air through a filter, slowly, for hours. Later, someone counts what got caught on that filter. Alpha activity, beta activity, little fingerprints of decay. It is quiet work, done in a room that smells like paper and solvent, far from the drill chatter. And that distance matters, because danger that lives in another building feels negotiable. You go back to hauling because the blasted rock will not move itself. Your cart fills with broken stone that looks like nothing. That is the cruel joke of ore. It is valuable only after it stops being rock. For now, it is just weight, and your spine is the delivery vehicle. In some mines, diesel equipment has replaced some of the muscle. A loader noses in, metal beast with a bucket mouth. Its engine heat makes the air feel thick, even if the rock walls are cold. Diesel exhaust adds its own invisible risk, because mines are good at collecting whatever humans produce: carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, soot, that faint chemical bite that tells you combustion happened nearby. Ventilation is supposed to dilute all of it. Supposed to is a soft phrase underground. You learn to read the mind with your body. If your throat feels raw, you tell yourself it is just dust. If you cough, you tell yourself it is just the cold air. If your eyes sting, you blame the drill smoke, the blasting fumes, the oil mist. This is how chronic exposure hides. It always has a plausible excuse. And while you are busy explaining away your symptoms, your lungs are doing their own bookkeeping. The particulate matter that lands deep in the alveoli does not have an easy exit. Your cilia cannot reach that far down. So, macrophages show up. Immune cells that eat debris like janitors with no vacation days. They engulf particles, crawl toward the small airways, and try to push the waste back up. Sometimes it works. Sometimes the load is too heavy, and the macrophage dies, spilling the particle again, like a tragic little loop. Over time, inflammation can become a permanent tenant. The lung tissue responds by laying down collagen, thickening walls that were meant to stay thin. That is fibrosis, which is a polite word for scarring. Scarring makes breathing feel like pulling air through a damp cloth. Silica dust is especially good at causing this. Silicosis, it is called, and it is not a uranium-specific problem. It is a mining classic, an old story told in coughs. Now add radon progeny into the mix, those solid decay products stuck to dust. They lodge in branching points where airflow changes direction. They sit on moist tissue, and their alpha particles travel only a short distance, which is the whole problem. They deposit their energy in a few cells. Not spread out gently. It is like tapping a wall versus punching one brick. The damage is localized, and DNA does not appreciate being punched. A lot of the time, nothing happens. Cells repair, cells die. The tissue continues, but probability does not need certainty. It only needs repetition. And you are very good at repeating shifts. In the early uranium boom, particularly in parts of the American Southwest and other mining regions, many miners were not fully informed about radon risk. Some did not even have consistent ventilation, especially in smaller operations chasing ore quickly. There were warnings in the scientific literature because radon and lung cancer had been observed in European mines long before the Cold War. The Schneeberg miners in Germany had a notorious history of lung disease centuries earlier, though they did not know the mechanism then. They called it mountain sickness. It turned out to be a mix of dust and radon exposure, a lethal partnership. But knowing something in a journal and enforcing it in a tunnel are different activities. The Cold War had a way of making delays feel patriotic. If someone said, "Slow down, add better fans, improve dust control," you could always answer with urgency. The ore is needed. The contract is waiting. The nation is depending on you, or at least someone says it is. So the job continues with the usual human logic. Immediate needs feel real. Long-term risk feels like a rumor. You finish the shift with dust in your hair, dust in your eyebrows, dust in places you did not know had places. You wash up as well as you can, but mine dust is clingy. It is not romantic soot you can wipe off with one dramatic gesture. It is mineral powder that likes the seams of your skin. You go home, or to a bunkhouse, or to a trailer that shakes in the wind, and you carry the mine with you in your clothes, unless there is a changing facility that keeps dirty and clean separate. That separation, by the way, is not just for comfort. It keeps contamination from following you into kitchens and beds. It keeps small children from hugging your work shirt and inhaling what you brought home. In many early operations, that kind of careful boundary was not standard. Not because people loved danger, because systems only improve after they have been embarrassed by reality. Now, while you are still thinking about airflow and dust, the mine does a quiet trick. It reminds you that this is only the first step. The ore you dragged out is not the end of uranium. It is the beginning of a long, unromantic journey into paperwork, chemistry, and barrels with stencils. The cart you loaded is hauled toward daylight, and the light at the tunnel mouth looks almost unreal. Not holy, just bright, like an overexposed photograph. Your eyes adjust slowly because underground living makes you suspicious of sunlight. Outside, the air feels thin and sharp compared to the mine. It smells like sage, diesel, and hot metal. The ore is dumped into piles that look like ordinary gravel heaps. No glow, no melodrama, just rocks sitting under sky, waiting to be transformed into something that can be shipped. And now you follow that transformation, because the middle step is where danger becomes administrative. The ore goes to a mill, a processing facility that looks like any other industrial plant from a distance. Tin buildings, pipes, tanks, conveyors that creak and clatter like long metal insects. You might think milling is where the science becomes elegant. It is not. It is where the rock gets bullied until it gives up its uranium. First comes crushing. Big jaw crushers chew rocks into smaller rocks. Then grinders turn small rocks into coarse sand, and then into slurry. Water is added because industries love turning solids into liquids they can pump. The air here smells different than the mine. Less damp stone, more chemical tang, like metal and wet concrete. The noise is constant, a factory roar that has no patience for silence. Dust is still here, but now it comes from crushing and conveying. Dust control is still a battle, just fought in daylight. Sprays, enclosures, ventilation hoods, all the same boring heroics. Now the chemistry begins. There are different milling methods, but a common theme is leaching. You mix the crushed ore with a solution that dissolves uranium compounds out of the rock. Often it is sulfuric acid, sometimes alkaline solutions like sodium carbonate, depending on the ore type. In human terms, you are making uranium leave the rock by making the environment too unpleasant to stay. Acid leaching means tanks with corrosive liquids, pipes that can leak, pumps that can fail, and workers who learn to respect splash zones. A chemical burn is immediate, honest pain. It does not wait decades to introduce itself. so people tend to take it seriously, which is one reason chemical hazards feel more real than radiation to many workers. After leaching, you separate the pregnant solution from the solids, thickeners, settlers, filters, equipment that looks like it belongs in a brewery, if breweries were obsessed with misery. The leftover solids become tailings, a damp sand of crushed rock that still contains decay products, heavy metals, and whatever the process did not remove. Tailings are not just dirt, they are the mine's remainder, the part that does not fit the story of useful resource. And they have to go somewhere. We will come back to them because tailings are one of the most stubborn aftertastes of uranium work. For now, you stay with the uranium that dissolved into solution. Next comes concentration. You precipitate uranium out, often by adding ammonia or other reagents, making a solid form that can be filtered and dried. This is where Yellowcake appears. And Yellowcake is a deeply disappointing name. It is not cake. It is not dessert. It is a powder, often yellow to brown, depending on impurities, mostly uranium oxides. It looks like industrial flour that someone dropped in a shop. If you put it in a bag, it sits there quietly, like any other powdered commodity. But it is heavy, and it is chemically toxic, and it is radioactive enough to deserve respect, not glowing. Just persistent. The drying step can create fine particulates, which means inhalation risk returns, now in a concentrated form. In the mine, uranium is spread thin. At the mill, you are collecting it, and concentration is another word for making mistakes matter more. So mills use baghouses, filters, ventilation, and procedures meant to keep powder where it belongs. Powder is slippery socially. It gets on surfaces, it gets on hands, it gets tracked. It gets into the air when a bag is dropped, or a conveyor vibrates, or a valve is opened too quickly. Workers might wear respirators here, especially in later years. But again, comfort negotiates. A respirator is hot. It pinches. It fogs goggles. It makes a long shift feel longer. Congratulations, you have discovered that safety is often a war against irritation. Yellowcake gets packaged, typically in drums. Steel drums with lids that clamp down, labeled and tracked. This is where the Cold War flavor becomes stronger. There are forms. There are custody transfers. There are security requirements. A drum is weighed, sampled, sealed. It becomes an object with a paper trail. And paper trails are how societies pretend they can control invisible things. You might not know where your drum goes next. Conversion, enrichment, fuel fabrication, weapons programs, reactors. Those steps are usually far away, physically and culturally. The mill is a middle world between the mine and the atom. It is where raw rock becomes a commodity, and like all commodity work, it can feel numb. You handle your piece of the chain. You run your equipment. You watch gauges. You log numbers. You go home. Some workers in mills had their own exposure risks, different from miners. There is less radon accumulation than deep underground, usually. But there is more chemical handling. Acid mist can irritate lungs and skin. Solvents used in some extraction methods can be toxic. Ammonia can burn eyes and throat. And uranium itself, as a heavy metal, is chemically harmful to kidneys if it gets into the body in significant amounts. Radiation is not the only villain. Chemistry can ruin your day with no help from physics. A spill here is not a glowing puddle either. It is a wet stain on concrete that someone has to neutralize and scrub. It is a hose connection that fails, splashing acid. It is a valve that sticks, sending slurry where it should not go. Factories create hazards, the way ovens create heat, naturally, predictably, without malice. The human response is procedure. Eye wash stations, secondary containment, training videos with actors pretending to be calm, and the quiet reality that not every plant in every era had the same standards. If you are working in the early boom years, you might have less automation, more manual handling, more open tanks, more dust, more improvisation. If you are working later, you might have more monitoring, more containment, more rules. But even with rules, the day can still be messy. Equipment wears out, management pressures production, people get tired, and tired people make small mistakes. And small mistakes in industrial systems can become big ones if the wrong valve is open. The unromantic middle step is mostly this: a long series of controlled annoyances. It is pipes and pumps and sampling. It is forklifts moving drums. It is a supervisor checking inventories. It is a guard at a gate, because now the material is not just ore, it is strategic. And that strategic feeling shows up as quiet tension, not fireworks, a locked door, a sign that says authorized personnel only, a visitor log, a reminder that you are handling something that has a shadow larger than your job description. You might feel proud or uneasy, or mostly just hungry for lunch. Most people are complicated that way. Now the drums are loaded onto trucks or rail cars because the chain has to keep moving. And when something starts traveling, it spreads its story across the landscape. The mine was a point on a map. The mill is another point. Between them are roads, towns, diners, rivers, dry washes, and the patient soil that receives whatever humans drop. So you ride along, metaphorically, with a shipment leaving the plant. The truck's suspension groans as it takes the weight. The driver checks paperwork with the kind of seriousness reserved for things that can ruin your week. And the drums sit quietly behind metal walls, as if they are just paint or grain. From the outside, it looks boring. It is supposed to look boring. Boring is how dangerous materials move through civilization without causing panic. But civilization is porous. Dust escapes. Spills happen. Tailings piles erode in wind. Water flows downhill. And that is where the landscape enters the story. Because the landscape is the only witness that never clocks out. You arrive, in your mind, at the edge of a mining town that grew too fast. The streets are a mix of paved and not quite. There are trailers, small houses, hastily built storefronts. There is a bar, because there is always a bar. There is a grocery, because miners eat, even when history is being made. The air smells like exhaust, dry dirt, and sometimes the faint sourness of industrial waste if the wind is unkind. Mining towns have a particular kind of temporary confidence. Everyone acts like the boom will last, because acting otherwise is depressing. But the buildings often look like they are ready to be abandoned at short notice, because they are. The equipment yards are full of spare parts and worn tires. The edges of town blur into the open land, and the open land looks empty until you realize it is full of quiet life, shrubs, insects, small mammals that do not care about geopolitics. And then, near the mill or mine, you see the tailings. A tailings pile is a man-made dune, pale and fine-grained. It can look almost smooth, like a beach that forgot the ocean. Sometimes it is impounded behind a dam, a tailings pond where slurry was sent to settle. Sometimes it is a dry stack. However it is stored, it is a repository of what the process left behind. It contains rock that has been crushed, which means it has a lot of surface area. More surface area means more opportunity for chemical reactions, leaching, and radon release. Uranium may be mostly removed, but the decay chain elements can remain, like radium. Radium can continue to produce radon over time, so the tailings can breathe radon into the air for years. Not dramatically, just steadily. Wind can pick up fine particles and carry them. If the pile is not covered or stabilized, dust storms can redistribute tailings across nearby land. That means contamination does not always stay in its assigned zone. It goes where wind goes, and wind, like paperwork, does not ask permission. Then there is water. Water is always the main character in environmental stories because it moves and it remembers. In arid regions, water is precious, which means it gets reused. Mills use water to make slurry, to leach, to wash, to cool. That water can contain dissolved metals and radionuclides, depending on the process and controls. Tailings ponds can seep if not properly lined. Surface runoff can carry contaminants during heavy rains. When rain finally comes, it does not arrive politely. It arrives as sudden sheets hitting dry ground that forgot how to drink slowly. You watch water bead and run off hard-packed soil, gathering speed like it has somewhere better to be. It finds gullies, ditches, tire ruts, and old stream beds. It moves like a rumor, following the easiest path downhill. And as it moves, it picks things up. Fine tailings grains, salts from evaporated ponds, little flakes of rust, and whatever was left on the surface. You can call it runoff if you want the calm word. But what it really is transport. The landscape is a conveyor belt that runs whenever the weather flips the switch. In dry months, the tailings pile sits still, wearing a crust like a scab. Then a wind comes through and the crust breaks into powder. Now the pile is not a pile anymore. It is a small weather system. You stand downwind and feel grit tap your cheeks. It tastes like chalk and old pennies. It coats plants in a thin film that blocks sunlight and turns leaves into dusty paper. You think contamination has to look dramatic, like a glowing spill in a movie. Wrong. In real life, it looks like dust on a windowsill, and you wipe it away without thinking. Tailings are extra annoying because they are finely crushed. Crushing increases surface area, and surface area is where chemistry happens. Rainwater becomes slightly acidic as it absorbs carbon dioxide from air and soil. That mild acidity is enough to dissolve small amounts of metals over time. Uranium mines and mills can leave behind elements like radium, thorium, arsenic, selenium, and lead, depending on the geology. Not all sites have the same mix, which is the first way nature refuses to be convenient. Groundwater moves slowly, like the world's laziest courier. But slow does not mean harmless. Slow just means you can ignore it for a decade and still be surprised later. You picture groundwater as an underground river, clear and dramatic. Usually, it is not. It is more like dampness moving through pores, through sand grains and fractures. If a tailings pond seeps, the seepage can carry dissolved contaminants into that damp flow. The plume spreads, often in a direction you can predict with hydrogeology, which is a fancy word for guessing where water will go, and being humbled anyway. Wells are the human interface with this hidden world. A well is a straw into the dark. People draw water for drinking, for livestock, for irrigation. They taste it, and if it tastes normal, they trust it. But uranium and radium do not need to taste like anything. Neither does arsenic, which is rude considering its reputation. Sampling schedules, bottles filled with water and labeled in neat handwriting. Laboratories measuring concentrations in units so small they feel imaginary. This is one of the recurring themes of the uranium story. The harm is often quiet, and the response is paperwork. Now zoom out, and you see how a mining district changes a whole region. A road gets paved to handle trucks. Then that road invites more traffic, because roads are suggestions the world takes seriously. A rail spur gets added, because bulk materials like trains, power lines stretch out, because mills do not run on good intentions. A town grows around paychecks, and then grows dependent on them. Every boomtown has the same mood: optimism in the morning, exhaustion at night, and a low background anxiety no one names. You walk through the town on a windy day. Dust skitters across the street like little animals. Kids play near yards where work boots sit on porches. Someone grills meat, and the smell is comforting enough to make you forget everything else. That is how humans survive living near industry. You normalize it. You call it the smell of work. But the land is keeping notes, not in words, but in layers. A little extra metal in sediment. A slightly elevated radiation reading on a rock that did not used to have it. A patch of plants growing strangely well because they like disturbed soil, or growing strangely poorly because dust has been coating their stomata. If you are in the American Southwest, there is another layer to the story. A lot of uranium mining happened on or near Navajo Nation lands. Workers and families were exposed through mines, mills, and building materials made from mine waste. In some places, tailings or waste rock were used in construction because it was there and it was free. Concrete needs aggregate, roads need fill, and poor communities use what is available. Congratulations, you have invented a public health problem out of thrift. When waste rock contains radium, it can produce radon gas. Radon seeps into enclosed spaces, especially poorly ventilated homes. It accumulates quietly, like dust under a bed. And because it is invisible, people assume the air is fine. You can only know with a detector, a little plastic canister, or electronic sensor. Testing is boring, which is why it often happens after someone gets sick. This uneven distribution of risk is not unique to uranium. It is a general feature of industrial history. Benefits tend to be concentrated in paychecks and contracts. Burdens tend to be spread out in dust and water. And the burdens last longer because tailings do not retire. Now, while you are looking at the land, the Cold War is still humming in the background. It is not visible in the sky, It is in procurement, documents, and quotas, and security fences. It is in the feeling that the work must continue even if the cleanup is inconvenient. And that mindset shapes how sites were built. Early tailings impoundments were sometimes just convenient low spots, a valley with a dam, a pond with settling, minimal lining, because lining costs money and time. Later practices improved because the world slowly learned to fear leaching more than it feared paperwork. A modern tailing cell might have clay liners, synthetic membranes, seepage collection, and engineered covers. Covers are meant to reduce radon release and prevent water infiltration. They are like putting a lid on a problem and hoping the lid stays put. The cover can include compacted clay, gravel layers, and topsoil with vegetation. Vegetation reduces erosion because roots hold soil and leaves slow wind. But plants also complicate things because roots can penetrate layers. Burrowing animals can make tunnels. The earth is not good at respecting your design drawings. So engineered barriers are a negotiation with biology and weather. Every site has its own argument with time. And time is very patient. Now, let your attention slide from soil and water to something even smaller, because the landscape keeps memory, and so do you. Your body does not store history in piles and ponds. It stores it in cells. And cells are obsessive record keepers, even when you are asleep. So you step away from the tailings and into your own tissues. Not metaphorically either. You become small, shrunken down to the scale where harm actually happens. You are inside a lung, deep in a branching airway, where airflow slows down. The walls are wet and pink. The air is warm and smells faintly metallic, like blood and salt. You hear nothing because your ears are not invited to this scale. Instead, you feel motion, the gentle expansion and contraction of tissue. Each breath is a tide. You are at the end of a bronchiole near an alveolus, one of millions of tiny air sacs. The alveolus is thin, delicate, and efficient. It is built like a compromise between sturdiness and speed. Oxygen must cross into blood quickly, so the barrier is almost absurdly thin. On the other side, a red blood cell slides past, squashed and flexible. It is a delivery truck made of membrane and hemoglobin. It does not care about your thoughts. It cares about gradients. Now, imagine a tiny particle arriving with the breath. It is so small, you cannot feel it. It is a bit of dust carrying a radon decay product like polonium or lead. It sticks to the moist lining because wet surfaces are sticky at this scale. And now, the real story begins. Radiation is not a curse. It is not a mist. It is energy leaving an atom that cannot settle down. Some atoms are unstable, which is a polite way of saying they are impatient. They rearrange themselves by throwing off pieces or waves. That throwing off is radiation. There are a few main flavors, and each one behaves differently. Alpha particles are heavy, like a tiny cannonball. They are 2 protons and 2 neutrons, basically a helium nucleus. They do not travel far because they bump into things and lose energy quickly. Beta particles are lighter, basically electrons, faster and more penetrating. Gamma rays are not particles in the same way. They are high-energy photons. They are like invisible X-rays that can pass through you. depending on energy. In a mine, gamma radiation from ore exists, but for many workers, the bigger lung risk came from alpha emitters lodged inside. Alpha is the villain that sounds harmless until it is sitting on your tissue. A sheet of paper stops alpha in air, but your lung is not paper. Your lung is living cells with DNA coiled inside. When an alpha particle shoots out, it travels a short distance and dumps energy along the way. It ionizes molecules, knocking electrons off atoms. Ionization is what makes radiation biologically dangerous. It turns stable molecules into reactive fragments. It can break chemical bonds, including bonds in DNA. DNA is a long molecule, a twisted ladder. It holds instructions in sequences of bases. The bases are like letters, but the paper is chemical, and the ink is fragile. A strong ionization track can cause a single-strand break, or a double-strand break, which is the big one. If both strands break near each other, repair becomes difficult. Your cell has repair systems because life has been dealing with radiation forever. Background radiation comes from cosmic rays, from rocks, from potassium in bananas, from the universe being mildly rude. So your cells evolved tools. There are enzymes that detect damage, cut, paste, and rejoin. There are checkpoints that pause cell division until repairs are made. There is even a self-destruct option, apoptosis, which is a cell choosing death for the good of the body. Very noble, very inconvenient for the cell. Most of the time, repair works. You are alive because repair works. But repair is not magic. Repair is chemistry under pressure. And chemistry makes mistakes, especially when damage is frequent. Chronic exposure is the exhausting version of danger. Not one catastrophic hit, but thousands of tiny insults. A little damage today, a little tomorrow, and the system never gets a quiet night shift. Over years, the probability of a bad repair increases. A mutation that affects cell cycle control. A mutation in a tumor suppressor gene. A change that makes a cell slightly less obedient. Cancer is not a single event, usually. It is a slow bureaucratic collapse inside tissue. Rules get ignored one at a time. A cell begins to divide when it should not. It avoids death signals. It recruits blood supply. It becomes selfish in a body built on cooperation. And you do not feel this happening. That is another insult. Your body does not give you a warning light for microscopic rebellion. It just keeps breathing, keeps working, keeps letting you believe you are fine. Now, slide your attention to another aspect of uranium exposure, because not all radioactive material stays in the lungs. Some gets swallowed, cleared by mucus, and enters the digestive system. Some can dissolve and enter blood, depending on chemical form. Uranium as a heavy metal has chemical toxicity. It tends to affect kidneys because kidneys filter blood and concentrate waste. Your kidneys are like a pair of quiet laboratories, constantly running fluid through membranes. They do not ask for applause. They also do not appreciate heavy metals. So the risk from uranium is a mix. Radiological risk from its decay products, especially alpha emitters in the right place. Chemical risk from the metal itself, if it enters the body in soluble form. And then there is external radiation, which matters more in some jobs than others. In the mine, gamma exposure might be present near ore bodies, but distance and time matter a lot. Radiation obeys geometry. If you double distance, intensity drops sharply, following an inverse square law for point sources, which is a fancy way to say, step back and you get less. But in cramped tunnels, stepping back is not always an option. And when the source is in your lungs, distance is zero. Congratulations, you have found the one place geometry cannot save you. Now, because fear is always hungry, people tend to imagine radiation as mystical. It is not. It is ordinary physics doing ordinary damage to ordinary chemistry. The reason it feels uncanny is because you cannot sense it. You can sense heat, you can sense smoke, you can smell gas leaks sometimes. But radiation does not come with a built-in alarm. So humans invented one. A Geiger counter clicks, and the clicking becomes the soundtrack of dread. But clicking is not danger itself, it is information. The machine detects ionizing events and converts them into sound. It is translating the invisible into annoyance, and humans are very responsive to annoyance. Now go back to the mill and the mine, and notice the main theme. Most hazards are handled by controlling pathways. Keep dust out of lungs. Keep contaminated water out of wells. Keep powder in drums. Keep radon diluted by airflow. And keep track of exposure with monitoring. Monitoring is how you turn a foggy risk into a number. And numbers, while not comforting, at least let you argue with reality. A worker might wear a dosimeter, a little badge that records radiation exposure. Some use film badges where radiation darkens film. Some use thermoluminescent dosimeters, crystals that store energy and release light when heated in a lab. In human terms, it is a tiny receipt for invisible events. Air monitoring can use pumps and filters like we mentioned. Radon monitoring can use detectors placed in work areas. The point is to know, not to guess. But in many early Cold War operations, knowing was inconsistent. Sometimes measurements were not taken frequently. Sometimes results were not shared clearly. Sometimes the science existed, but the logistics did not. And sometimes, bluntly, production mattered more. This is not because every manager was a villain twirling a mustache. It is because systems are lazy. They follow incentives. If the incentive is ore output, you get ore output. If the incentive is long-term health, you get fans, masks, and medical surveillance. Many places learned this late. Now, let your perspective widen again. You are no longer a particle in a lung. You are a worker sitting in a clinic chair years after the mine. The room smells like disinfectant and paper. The air is too warm because clinics always are. A technician asks you to hold your breath for an X-ray. You do because you are good at following instructions by now. The image appears, and it is a grayscale map of your ribs and lungs. The doctor looks at it longer than you like. Silence has weight in a medical room. This is one of the ways the long tail of exposure reveals itself. Not with drama, but with appointments. Epidemiology is the science of patterns in groups. It is how we learned about radon and lung cancer in miners. It is not glamorous science. It is phone calls, records, follow-ups, and statistics. It is comparing rates, controlling for smoking, controlling for age, trying to isolate what the mine did. Because humans do not live in controlled experiments. They smoke, they drink, they move, they switch jobs. So the signal is buried in noise, and yet the signal emerged in many cohorts. higher lung cancer rates associated with radon progeny exposure in underground uranium miners. This helped drive regulations, ventilation standards, and exposure limits. But the timeline matters. Those protections often arrived after a generation had already breathed the old air. Safety in industry is frequently written in hindsight. It is like a lesson the world insists you pay for twice. Now, because this is a bedtime story for the existentially curious, you get the philosophical version too. You live in a universe where cause and effect can be separated by decades. That is not comforting. It means you can make choices and only meet their consequences much later. It means a society can build power plants, weapons, and cities on a resource and only later see the cost in bodies and soil. That delay is part of why humans keep repeating mistakes. Immediate rewards feel real. Future harm feels abstract. The mind understands this deeply, even though it does not have a brain. Now, speaking of brains, let us go back to the Cold War machine above ground. Because demand is not just an economic force, it is a psychological one. Uranium became strategic, and strategic materials attract secrecy. Secrecy changes how people talk. It changes who is allowed to know what. You might work a mine and not know whether the ore feeds reactors or weapons. You might suspect because everyone suspects. But suspicion is not information, and when information is scarce, rumor expands to fill the space. Some rumors make the work feel heroic. Some make it feel cursed. Most just make it feel strange. The government might set purchase prices, guaranteeing a market. That stimulates rapid exploration and mining, because money is persuasive. Geologists fan out across the desert with scintillation counters. Those are radiation detectors that flash when they detect gamma rays. You walk behind one, listening to it chatter. The clicks speed up near certain rocks. It feels like prospecting with an invisible metal detector. Except the treasure is an element that makes the 20th century nervous. A uranium boom can turn remote land into a grid of claims. Stakes in the ground, paperwork filed at county offices, and then, suddenly, a quiet canyon has trucks. It has drill rigs. It has men with lunch pails and cigarettes, because time period accuracy is not optional here. The ore gets pulled out fast because contracts reward speed. Speed tends to reduce caution because caution feels like delay. And delay, in the Cold War mindset, feels like weakness. This is how geopolitics leaks into lungs. Not as ideology, but as schedule. Now, you might expect the workers to be told clearly about radon. In some places and times, they were not. Sometimes, companies did not want to alarm workers. Sometimes, they did not want liability. Sometimes, they did not want paperwork that could later be read out loud in court. Sometimes, they honestly did not know enough because the science was not distributed evenly. Sometimes they knew, but treated it like weather, inconvenient and beyond their control. And sometimes they assumed the miners would not understand, which is a very efficient way to stay in charge. You are down there anyway because a mortgage does not accept good intentions as payment. You are down there because the mine is hiring, and the diner is not. You are down there because your cousin said it was steady work, and steady is rare. So the information you get is fragmented. A safety talk here, a rumor there, a newspaper article folded into a back pocket. You hear that radiation can make you sick, but you also hear that it is mostly the dust. You hear that smoking makes it worse, but you also hear that the company doctor says you are fine. You hear the word radon, and it floats around your brain like a spelling mistake. Radon sounds like a brand name for a vacuum cleaner. In reality, it is a gas that slips out of rock because atoms do not feel loyal. The Cold War made a strange emotional climate for all of this. Secrecy does not just hide information. It changes how people behave. It makes questions feel disloyal. It makes curiosity feel like trouble. It makes the quiet worker who asks about ventilation feel like an inconvenience. And underground, inconvenience is treated like weakness. You watch the foreman glance at the clock. You watch the drill steels get lined up like instruments. You watch the muck pile get judged for how fast it can be moved. The schedule is the real religion here. Everything else, including lungs, is negotiable. There is a word that floats around these operations, even if nobody says it out loud. Acceptable. Acceptable exposure. Acceptable risk. Acceptable is a word that means someone did the math without asking you. It means the probability looked fine on paper. It also means the consequences are paid in a currency you do not keep in your wallet. The mine offers you another kind of currency: overtime bonus pay. A promotion to equipment operator if you stick around. And when you are tired and dusty and trying to keep a household together, the future becomes a soft thing. A decade from now is hazy. Tonight's dinner is sharp, so you keep showing up. Now imagine you are not the miner. You are the air itself, pushed through the mine by fans that complain with every rotation. You travel down ducting that leaks at the seams. You spill around corners looking for the easiest path because air is lazy. You flow past a face where blasting fumes still linger, heavy with nitrogen oxides. You pick up dust because dust is always looking for a ride. You pick up radon because radon does not need an invitation. If the mine has good ventilation, you are replaced often. You are diluted, refreshed, sent back out before you can become a concentrated problem. If the mine has poor ventilation, you linger. You sit in dead ends, in low points, in side headings where nobody wants to install extra ducting. You become a slow soup of exhaust, dust, and invisible decay products. And the miners keep breathing you, because what else are they going to do? There were standards, eventually. Those standards arrived like apologies. People began to talk about working level months, a unit for radon progeny exposure. It is not a poetic unit. It is the kind of unit that exists because too many men coughed in the same way. A working level is basically a measure of how much alpha energy is available in the air from radon decay products. You do not need to love the definition. You only need to understand why it mattered. Because the danger was not radon as a concept. It was the stuff radon turned into, hanging in the air, sticking to dust, getting caught in lungs. Once you can measure it, you can argue about it. Once you can argue about it, you can regulate it. And once you can regulate it, you can watch companies discover new respect for fans. Fans became more than background noise. They became compliance. They became the difference between operating and being shut down. It is amazing how quickly a hazard becomes real when it threatens profit. But early on, before many of those rules had teeth, you are stuck with the older logic. Keep your head down. Do the shift. Take the paycheck. Do not think too hard about a gas you cannot smell. Above ground, the secrecy is thick in a different way. A mill manager might know more than a miner. A government purchaser might know more than the mill manager. A weapons scientist in a clean lab might know the most and still never see the dust. This is how large systems function. Information moves upward, and everyone tells themselves it is necessary. You feel it in the small rituals. A locked filing cabinet, a guarded gate, a rule about photography, a rumor that a neighbor got questioned for talking too much at a bar. The work becomes both ordinary and strangely unspeakable. You dig rock, but you are not supposed to say why it matters. And when you cannot say why it matters, it is harder to say what it costs. Now follow the ore again, not because it is glamorous, but because the chain continues. A drum of Yellowcake gets loaded into a truck. The truck drives a long road through open land. The land is wide enough to make you feel small, which is appropriate. The driver stops for coffee. The drum sits quietly, because drums are good at waiting. This is another theme. Radioactive material is rarely in a hurry. Humans are the ones sprinting around it. Eventually, the material reaches conversion facilities, where uranium oxide becomes uranium hexafluoride. That is a chemical step, and it is a step that has its own sharp teeth. Uranium hexafluoride is used because it can be a gas at manageable temperatures. Gas is useful for enrichment because gases can be spun, filtered, coaxed into separating isotopes. But uranium hexafluoride has an ugly personality. If it meets moisture, it reacts. It can form hydrofluoric acid, which is a chemical that does not negotiate. Hydrofluoric acid is famous for penetrating tissue, binding calcium, and causing deep damage with delayed pain. It is one of those substances that makes you realize nature has no obligation to be gentle. So, the later parts of the uranium chain trade, dust for chemistry. Different hazards, different rooms, same basic human problem. A system with invisible danger requires trust, and trust is expensive. Now drift back to the miner again, because the miner is where the story becomes personal. You are off shift, sitting at a kitchen table that wobbles slightly. You are drinking coffee that tastes like burned beans. Your hands have small cuts because rock is not polite. Your shirt smells faintly of metal and damp dust even after a wash. Someone asks what your day was like. You say, fine. You always say, fine, because the details are boring, and also because the details are strange. How do you explain that your workplace is a hole that breathes? How do you explain that the danger is a gas no one can detect without a gadget? How do you explain that the government wants what you dig, but does not want you talking about it? So you say, fine, and this is how a society builds an atomic age on ordinary conversations. Fine. Now the years pass, and you do not feel like a character in a documentary. You feel like a person who gets older. Your knees hurt. Your hearing gets a little worse because drills are loud and ear protection was not always a habit. Your lungs feel tired when you climb stairs. Maybe you smoke because stress likes companions. Maybe you do not, but your coworkers do, and underground air is communal. Secondhand smoke was just called air back then. In the background, the science keeps evolving. Researchers keep counting cases. They compare groups of miners with different exposures. They notice dose-response patterns, meaning more exposure tends to mean more risk. They argue about confounding factors, meaning all the other things that can cause lung cancer. They write papers with calm titles that hide heavy conclusions. They build the case that radon progeny in mines is not just a theoretical worry. It is a hazard that leaves a signature in human bodies. This work eventually spills into public awareness. Radon is not only a mine problem, radon is also a home problem. Because radon comes from uranium and rock is everywhere. You can have a safe life and still have radon seeping into your basement. You can have a clean house and still have a gas collecting in the lowest room. Congratulations, the universe found a way to be annoying even in your own home. So part of the uranium miner story becomes a broader story. It becomes the story of how people learned that geology can reach into lungs through air. It becomes the story of mitigation, fans in basements, vents through slabs, plastic barriers. It becomes the story of measuring invisible things, because you got tired of guessing. But for miners, the timeline is harsh. The learning often comes after the breathing. So now, gently, you pivot into the next layer of the outline, because once you understand the body's constant repair work, you can understand why industry started building new layers of protection. Not out of kindness, usually, out of necessity, out of regulation, out of lawsuits, out of the slow embarrassment of evidence. Safety gear starts to appear more consistently, though it never looks heroic. A respirator is not inspiring. It is rubber and straps and the smell of your own breath. You put it on and it pinches your nose. It rubs your cheeks raw if you wear it long enough. It makes your voice sound trapped, like you are talking through a pillow, but it filters dust. It reduces what reaches those delicate alveoli. And in this story, small reductions matter. Ventilation improves too, in places where someone finally pays for it. Bigger fans, better ducting, more careful control of airflow paths, air curtains and stoppings that are installed correctly, not just roughly. Sometimes even automated monitoring that alarms when radon levels rise. An alarm is just a noise, but noise is what humans respond to. If the mind can turn an invisible hazard into a sound, suddenly it becomes harder to ignore. Dosimeters become more normal. A miner clips a badge to a shirt and it sits there quietly all day. It is a small witness. It records external radiation exposure over time. It does not help with radon progeny the same way, because that is an internal inhalation problem, but it is part of the broader safety culture. Air sampling becomes more systematic. A technician places pumps in different headings. Filters are collected and analyzed. The mine starts to resemble a place that is being measured, not just exploited. That shift in attitude matters, because unmeasured work becomes myth. Measured work becomes accountable. Even so, there is always friction. Safety rules are written by people who do not carry rock. They are enforced by supervisors who are judged on production. They are followed by workers who are tired and trying to get through a shift. So the gear gets worn incorrectly. The respirator seal breaks because of stubble. The filter cartridge is used longer than recommended. The mask hangs around the neck for just a moment, which becomes most of the day. Congratulations, you have discovered that procedure and reality are not the same species. There is also the problem of heat. Underground can be cold near the entrance, but deeper mines can be warm. Machinery adds heat. Compressed air tools add heat. Bodies add heat. Wearing extra gear and heat feels like punishment. So people compromise. They loosen straps. They skip steps. They take their chances. Because taking chances feels normal when chances are all you have. Monitoring has its own limitations. A reading tells you about an average, not about every breath. Sampling might happen in one area while you work in another. The mine changes, airflow changes when doors open and close. Radon release can change with geology and blasting. Dust spikes after blasts, and during mucking, a single number on a report cannot capture the full mess. But it is better than nothing, and safety is often just that, better than nothing. There is a certain bleak comfort in incremental improvement because it means the world can learn. Slowly, after people pay. Now look closely at one piece of gear that feels almost symbolic. The self-rescuer, a small device miners carry, meant to provide oxygen or convert carbon monoxide in an emergency. It sits on a belt like a brick of reassurance. It is for fires, explosions, bad air events. It is not for radon. It will not save you from slow exposure, but it is part of the same story. A story where air is never fully trusted underground. Air is something you manage, monitor, and sometimes fear. Mine safety is a whole ecosystem of controls. Engineering controls, like ventilation and water sprays, are best because they do not rely on perfect human behavior. Administrative controls, like limiting time in certain areas, require scheduling discipline. Personal protective equipment, like respirators, is the last line because it depends on you wearing it correctly every time. These layers are sometimes described like slices of Swiss cheese. Each layer has holes. If the holes line up, harm passes through. If they do not, you get lucky. It is not a bedtime metaphor, exactly, but it is accurate, and accuracy has its own soothing rhythm. Now step into a training room, because training rooms are where industries pretend they can control the future. You sit in a metal folding chair. A projector hums. A film plays, grainy, with a narrator who sounds too cheerful about lung cancer. You watch diagrams of lungs, arrows showing dust pathways, and cartoon fans pushing air. They tell you to wear your respirator. They tell you to report damaged ducting. They tell you that safety is everyone's responsibility, which is a phrase that often means nobody is truly responsible. Still, the information is getting closer to you now. Not perfect, not complete, but closer. That is how change happens in these systems. Not by sudden enlightenment, by creeping paperwork, by new standards, by inspectors showing up with clipboards, by unions pushing for safer conditions when unions are present, by families asking why someone coughs blood, by communities refusing to accept that sickness is just part of the job, and sometimes by the cold logic of economics. Because a sick workforce is expensive. A shutdown mine is expensive. A lawsuit is expensive. Human health becomes important when it becomes a line item. This is cynical, but cynicism is often just pattern recognition with poor manners. Now, with safety tightening in some places, you can feel the larger engine again, the Cold War. Because the Cold War is not only about bombs. It is about institutions that learn to treat uranium like a controlled substance and workers like replaceable parts. Strategic demand means the material is tracked. It means access is controlled. It means certain information is compartmentalized. And compartmentalization creates weird gaps. A miner knows the rock. A mill worker knows the slurry. A transport driver knows the route. A scientist knows the isotope ratios. A government official knows the stockpile targets. Nobody knows the whole creature. So the creature moves through society, fed by many hands, unseen as a whole. You feel that strangeness in the way people talk about their jobs. They say, "I work at the mine," or "I work at the plant." They do not say, "I feed the nuclear arsenal," even if that is true, even if everyone suspects it, because saying it out loud changes the air in the room. Secrecy makes language cautious. Cautious language makes reality feel unreal. And when reality feels unreal, it becomes easier to tolerate the intolerable. Now imagine you are a piece of paper, a requisition form, a shipping manifest, a purchase agreement. You sit in a file, stamped and signed. Your ink is crisp. You do not cough. You do not get cancer. You do not have a family. And yet, you are powerful. Because you decide that ore must move, that quotas must be met, that drums must ship. A mine can be dangerous, but a document can be relentless. The document does not feel fatigue. It does not get headaches from diesel fumes. It does not take off a respirator because it is hot. It just persists. This is the strange quiet of the era. The loudest forces are not always audible. They are bureaucratic. They are budgetary. They are geopolitical. They are written in offices with windows. Underground workers hear only the echo of those forces, translated into schedules. Now, let your attention slide forward in time again, because the rush does not last forever. Booms end. Contracts change. New sources are found. New technologies shift demand. Sometimes public attention turns, and uranium becomes less glamorous, more controversial, more regulated. Mines close one by one. A gate gets locked. A fan gets shut off. A tunnel fills with still air. Water begins to rise in abandoned workings because pumps stop running. The mine begins to return to geology, slowly. But the story does not end when the last shift clocks out. That is the part most people miss. They think of mining as something that happens and then stops. In reality, mining is something that happens and then leaves a long after image. So now you walk through the after, and it is quieter than the boom. The town has fewer trucks. The diner has fewer customers. Some houses are empty, windows dusty, yards turning back into weeds. And out near the mill site, the tailings remain. They have not moved. They have not healed. They simply sit there, doing slow chemistry in the sun. Cleanup begins in the least cinematic way possible. Survey teams arrive with instruments. They take measurements of radiation levels at the surface. They map contamination like weather forecasters map storms. They take soil samples in little bags. They take water samples in bottles. They label everything, because labels are how humans try to prevent chaos. They set up fences. They post signs. The signs are often blunt. Caution, radiation area, do not enter. But signs are only as powerful as the people who respect them. Animals do not read. Wind does not read. A curious kid does not always read. So cleanup has to be physical. Covers, caps, removal, stabilization. In some cases, contaminated structures are demolished. In some communities, houses built with mine waste are torn down or remediated. Imagine living in a home that had to be dismantled because the walls were quietly exhaling radon. It is hard to feel sentimental about drywall after that. Tailings piles may be moved. Sometimes they are relocated to engineered disposal cells. This means trucks, so many trucks, dump trucks that groan under fine sand, bulldozers pushing material into place, compactors pressing layers down. It is like building a landfill, except the contents have a longer memory. Engineered disposal cells are designed to isolate tailings from water and reduce radon release. They might include a thick earthen cover, clay layers, rock armor to prevent erosion, and vegetation. Rock armor is literally rock placed on top to resist wind and rain. Because the planet never stops trying to rearrange your work, rain wants to carve channels, wind wants to sandblast surfaces, freeze and thaw want to crack your careful layers, roots want to explore, burrowing animals want to dig. Even microbes have opinions, because microbes can change chemistry. So disposal is not a one-time act. It is a long argument with the future. Monitoring continues after cleanup, because the only way to know if a cap is working is to watch. Groundwater wells are installed around sites. Water levels are measured. Samples are taken regularly. Technicians look for trends, because trends are the early whispers of failure. Those trends can look boring on a spreadsheet, but they are the whole story. One year, the uranium level in a monitoring well is steady. The next year, it creeps up like a slow fever. That does not mean a catastrophe is happening today. It means water found a path, and water is very loyal to paths. You picture groundwater as a straight arrow from the tailings cell to a well. Wrong. It moves through fractures, lenses of sand, old channels, and whatever the last ice age left behind. Hydrogeologists draw maps with smooth lines anyway, because humans love pretending. Then they drill another well and the smooth line becomes a scribble. A lot of the long tail is like that. You build a cap, you install liners, you divert runoff, and then you wait. Waiting is not passive though. Waiting is maintenance, inspections, repairs, and arguments at budget meetings, because the cap has enemies that never retire. Wind lifts at the edges like a bored child picking tape. Rain finds tiny depressions and turns them into channels. Freeze and thaw pry apart compacted layers, one winter at a time. Plant roots try to colonize, because life treats disturbance like opportunity. A rabbit digs a burrow because rabbits do not respect engineered barriers. Congratulations, you have hired the entire ecosystem as your unpaid quality control team. So remediation plans include something called institutional controls. That is a polite phrase for fences, signs, and legal restrictions. It means you cannot build a school on the capped tailings pile. It means you cannot drill a drinking water well through a contaminated plume. It means someone, somewhere, is supposed to remember. That is the weirdest part. A disposal cell might be designed to last hundreds of years, but institutions struggle to last through a few elections. Land changes hands. Agencies get reorganized. Budgets get cut. The people who knew the site retire, and their replacement inherits a binder. The binder becomes the memory. If you want cosmic horror that feels cozy, try trusting a binder to outlive a century. In the United States, one of the big attempts at long memory is the Uranium Mill Tailings Radiation Control Act. That law pushed cleanup of many old milling sites, and it created standards for stabilizing tailings. Not because the universe became kind, because people finally noticed the pattern and got tired of paying for it. So sites were surveyed, prioritized, and remediated. Some tailings were moved away from rivers because rivers are excellent at spreading souvenirs. Some were capped in place because moving them would spread dust and cost money. Every choice is a trade. Move the tailings, and you reduce risk at the old site, but create risk along the haul route. Cap in place, and you avoid transport, but you commit to long-term maintenance. Engineers call this optimization. Communities call it living with it. Now you walk, in your mind, along the edge of a remediated site at dusk. The disposal cell is a low, broad hill, shaped too neatly to be natural. The top is covered with soil and rock, sometimes with a pale layer of riprap. That riprap is not decoration. It is armor, meant to resist erosion from rare, violent storms. Because deserts do not do gentle rain. They do months of nothing, then a sudden flood that acts personally offended. The fenced perimeter is quiet. A sign warns you in a font that feels tired. You stand there and realize the mine is over, but the work is not. This is the afterlife of extraction, a slow custodial job. Now, let the story slide from land back to bodies. Because bodies also get monitored, not with wells, but with medical files. A clinic might keep a registry of former workers, chest imaging, lung function tests, notes about coughs that never quite leave. Epidemiologists try to separate the mind from everything else in a person's life. Smoking, age, other jobs, genetics, infections, the ordinary chaos of being alive. They use control groups, statistical models, and cautious language. And behind that caution is a blunt truth. Some exposures have long latency periods, meaning the consequences show up late. A man can breathe radon progeny in his 20s and meet lung cancer in his 50s. That time gap is one reason the Cold War era felt so quiet. The work did not drop people immediately. It wore them down on a schedule that did not match paydays. Modern worker protection tries to shorten the gap between exposure and response. You monitor in real time, or close to it. You do air sampling during shifts, not years later. You track doses, and when they rise, you change the workflow. You rotate workers out of high exposure headings. You improve ventilation before the statistics arrive. This is what progress looks like in occupational health. Not perfection, just earlier intervention. There is another unpleasant detail about old sites. The mine itself can become a radon engine after closure. When ventilation fans stop, the underground workings become still. Radon seeps in, accumulates, and waits. If an old adit is open, radon can flow out depending on pressure changes. Warm air rises, cold air sinks, and mines can breathe with the seasons. In winter, cold, dense air can sink into openings, pushing mine air outward elsewhere. In summer, the flow can reverse. It is geology doing lung physics. Sometimes, an abandoned mine becomes attractive to curious people. Explorers, teenagers, hikers looking for shade, animals looking for shelter. They step inside, and the air tastes damp and metallic. They feel safe because nothing is happening, but the radon is there, and the oxygen can be low, and the roof can be unstable. Again, the danger does not announce itself. It waits for the kind of curiosity that ignores signs. And not all sites are fenced perfectly. Not all openings are sealed. Some are on remote land, and remote land hates maintenance schedules. So part of cleanup is simply closing the holes, bulkheads, backfill, caps, gates, concrete plugs. It is not glamorous, but it reduces both physical and radiological risk. Now step sideways into one of the stranger legacies of uranium work. The instruments themselves changed culture. Geiger counters, scintillation detectors, alpha meters, dosimeters. These tools gave people a new sense, a mechanical sixth sense for ionization. You can walk across a yard and hear the clicks change. You can find hotspots that your eyes would never notice. It is empowering and also unsettling because now you know how much you were never meant to perceive. A cleanup crew might scan a patch of soil and hear a faster chatter. They scrape off the top layer, bag it, and scan again. The clicks slow. That is the sound of progress in this world. Not applause, just fewer counts per minute. But the detector also teaches humility. Some radionuclides emit gamma rays that are easier to detect at a distance. Others are alpha emitters that hide unless you sample directly. If contamination is buried, the detector might not see it clearly. So you do soil cores. You slice layers like cake, the least fun cake imaginable. You measure each layer and build a depth profile. That profile tells you how deep the problem goes and how much clean soil you need on top. It is tedious, careful work. It is also the difference between containment and wishful thinking. Now, because you are a human with a brain that likes stories, you want a single villain, radon or uranium or the Cold War. But the reality is always a network. Geology gives you ore. Economics gives you pressure. Politics gives you secrecy. Engineering gives you partial solutions. And biology gives you latency. The suffering happens in the overlaps. One more detail that tends to get overlooked is the chemical side of tailings. Radioactivity gets the headlines because it feels spooky. But tailings can also mobilize heavy metals and salts and acidic drainage. If sulfide minerals are present, they can oxidize when exposed to air and water. That oxidation can produce sulfuric acid, which dissolves metals more easily. This is acid mine drainage, a classic mining problem. Not every uranium site has it, because geology varies. But when it occurs, it can keep leaching for a very long time. So remediation might include limiting oxygen and water infiltration, again with covers, or collecting seepage and treating it, which means pumps and treatment systems that must run. Treatment can involve neutralizing acidity with lime. It can involve precipitation, filtration, ion exchange, or reverse osmosis. In human terms, it is expensive plumbing, and expensive plumbing needs constant attention or it turns into broken plumbing. Now think about the communities around the old mines and mills. Cleanup is not just earth moving, it is trust building, which is harder. People want to know if their water is safe, if their kids are safe, if the dust on the windowsill is just dust. So agencies hold meetings, they show maps, they explain risk in careful words that never sound like comfort. They might say, the levels are below regulatory limits, which is true and also not emotionally satisfying. Because the community remembers the years when limits were not enforced or did not exist, memory is its own contaminant. It lingers. In some places, health programs were created to compensate and monitor former workers. In the United States, for example, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act aimed to acknowledge harms to miners and others. Paperwork again, but this time as apology, an application, proof of employment, medical documentation, a check, sometimes for a body that would prefer lungs. The long tail includes this too, the administrative afterlife. Now let the camera in your mind drift back to the mine during its working years, just briefly, to understand what changed. By the later decades, ventilation design became a serious discipline. Engineers calculated air quantities, pressure losses, and flow paths. They used auxiliary fans and ducting to push fresh air to headings. They measured radon progeny concentrations and set exposure limits. They used water sprays and wet drilling to suppress dust. Wet drilling is exactly what it sounds like. You feed water into the drill hole as you cut, so dust becomes slurry instead of floating. It is messy, but lungs prefer messy to sharp. In some mines, diesel equipment required additional controls. Diesel particulate matter is its own hazard, separate from radiation. So ventilation had to handle both, and that meant higher airflow rates. Higher airflow means bigger fans, and bigger fans mean power, cost, and noise. The mine becomes less like a cave and more like a ventilated factory. You still sweat, you still lift, you still get bored. But the invisible load in the air can be lower if the system is maintained. And maintenance is always the quiet weak point. A fan belt wears out, a duct tears, a door is left open, air short circuits, bypassing the work area. So modern mines treat ventilation as a primary system, not an afterthought, because the physics does not care about your shift schedule. Now, outside mining, uranium demand shifted too. Weapons programs peaked, then changed. Civilian nuclear power rose, then faced public fear after accidents. Uranium prices rose and fell, and mining followed, because mining is obedient to price. Some regions saw in situ recovery, also called in situ leaching. Instead of digging rock, you inject a solution into an ore body underground. The solution dissolves uranium, and you pump it back to the surface. It can reduce surface disturbance and dust, but it introduces a new anxiety: groundwater chemistry. You are intentionally moving solvents through an aquifer zone, so you need careful wellfield design, containment, and restoration afterward. Again, the trade: less dust and lungs, more responsibility in water. And responsibility, like tailings, does not evaporate. Now return to the abandoned mining town. Years after the rush, the streets are quieter. The equipment yard is rusting, metal returning to ore in slow motion. A chain link fence leans. A sign fades in the sun, its warning still legible. Barely. This is where you understand the full scale of the word legacy. The Cold War was loud in speeches, but its industrial footprint is quiet now. A capped pile, a monitored well, a medical registry, a story told by someone's uncle who never stopped coughing. And still, there is an odd comfort in the fact that you can measure it, you can sample, you can cap. You can reduce exposure. The universe is hostile, yes, but it is also consistent. Radon decays on schedule, water flows downhill, dust settles when you wet it. So the long tail is not hopeless. It is just slow. Now, while you are thinking about slowness, consider the timescales baked into uranium itself. Uranium has isotopes like uranium-238, which decays with a half-life so long, it makes human history look like a blink. A half-life is the time it takes for half the atoms in a sample to decay. Not all of them, just half. Then half of what remains, and so on, like an endlessly patient subtraction. So, uranium is not in a hurry to become something else. That is why it still exists on Earth at all. And it is why tailings, even after uranium is mostly removed, can still matter. The decay chain includes radium, and radium produces radon, and radon produces those lung-sticking daughters. A capped tailings pile is partly about keeping water out. It is also about reducing radon escape, like muffling a very slow leak. Engineers calculate radon flux, the rate at which radon comes out of a surface. They design covers thick enough that radon decays before it reaches open air, because radon has a half-life of about 4 days. If you force it to travel through dense soil long enough, many atoms decay before escaping. That is one of the few times physics feels like a favor. You are using time as a filter. The cap is not magic, it is delay. Now, to keep you grounded, remember that not every old site is remediated perfectly. Some are still being worked on. Some are on lists, waiting. Some are in countries with fewer resources, where fences and liners are luxuries. Uranium was mined in many places, from Central Asia to Africa to Australia to Europe to North America. The same basic pattern repeats, with local differences. Where regulation is strong, controls improve. Where regulation is weak, workers and land absorb more of the cost. This is not a uranium-specific moral. It is an industrial one. Now, let the story narrow again, back to a single worker, because bedtime stories, like individuals, you are a miner in the late stage of an operation. When safety has improved, but not become comfortable, you clip on a dosimeter, even though it mostly tracks gamma, not what you inhale. You check your respirator seal, a quick press, and inhale, feeling the mask suck slightly to your face. You hate it already. You step into the drift, and the fan noise is louder than it used to be. The airflow is stronger, cold against your sweat, a strange mix of relief and irritation. Water sprays hiss near the face, making the floor slick and the air damp. Your boots squelch. You drill with wet methods, and mud spatters your sleeves. It is disgusting, and it is safer, which is the usual deal. You look at the rock and feel none of the Cold War romance people like to paint on it later. You feel only the shift. The rock breaks, gets loaded, gets hauled. A technician comes by with an air sampler, tubing, and a small pump, setting it up like a ritual. They will measure later, count later, report later. And you will go home, and the mine will stay in your hair anyway. Even with better systems, nothing is clean. It is just cleaner. And in occupational health, cleaner matters. Now shift to the way the industry tried to communicate risk, because communication is its own hazard. Radiation is hard to explain without either minimizing or terrifying. Say it is safe, and you risk lying. Say it is dangerous, and you risk panic and paralysis. So you get bland language. You get permissible exposure limits. You get units like sieverts and rems, which sound like science fiction currencies. A sievert is a unit meant to capture biological effect, not just energy. It tries to weight different radiation types by their damage potential. Alpha gets a higher weighting because it is more biologically disruptive per unit energy when internal. This is important and also hard to make comforting. So most workers learn risk indirectly. They learn by what gets enforced. If the boss yells about wearing a respirator, that hazard feels real. If nobody checks, it feels optional. Human brains are trained by consequences, not pamphlets. And many early miners were trained by the absence of consequences, at least at first, which is why the later consequences felt unfair, like being punished for a rule nobody explained. Now, you are in the present day, visiting a reclaimed site that has been turned into something almost normal. Maybe it is open land with restricted use. Maybe it is a fenced mound with grass on top, too green for the surrounding desert. Maybe there is a marker, a stone, or sign meant to say, this place is not ordinary. Because humans worry, correctly, about forgetting. There is an entire field of thought about how to warn the far future about radioactive waste. What symbols will still mean danger? What language will be understood? How to say, do not dig here, to a civilization that might not know your words. Uranium tailings are not the same as high-level nuclear waste. But the anxiety is related. It is the anxiety of leaving something behind that outlasts your attention span. So you stand there and feel the scale mismatch. Your life is measured in decades. The half-lives are measured in millennia or longer. The land does not care, but you do, because you have to live on it. Now there is another grimly practical aspect of the long tail. Economics. Cleanup costs money for decades. Monitoring costs money. Maintaining fences costs money. Replacing signs costs money. And money comes from budgets, and budgets come from politics. So, the long tail is partly a question of commitment. Will a society keep paying attention when the drama is gone? Because drama funds projects. Boredom does not. Boredom is the enemy of environmental stewardship, and uranium cleanup is very